Shocking Pink, Homophobia and Abject Marketing in the Digital Age. From the Fashion, Style, and Queer Culture Conference 2021. The reference list is available on my website, markoconnellstudio.com. Dolce & Gabbana recently got into hot water with an advertising campaign that was so tone-deaf and racist that it caused substantial business losses in Asia and virulent backlash from pretty much everywhere else. While this particular incident was not planned, there have been other examples of egregious marketing, abject marketing, that have deliberately, it would seem, engaged with abhorrent themes. Sales suicide, one would presume? Actually, fashion brands are notorious for dropping crypto-offensive items into their marketing and then backing off with a negligible apology when customers react with legitimate offense. Meanwhile, social media hashtags multiply, disseminate, and generate viral visibility. And the associated brand is amplified exponentially. Unscrupulous, but very effective nonetheless. However, as consumers become increasingly habituated to this shock, brands must go to ever greater lengths to generate that negative reactive publicity that may well translate to higher sales. Thus, the content must become ever more provocative and now moves into dangerously racially charged and homophobic territory at times. The question then becomes, does this messaging feed into larger, more destructive forms of rhetoric in society? This research looks at the real-world applications of abject fashion marketing. The term that I have adopted to describe this type of content that has been designed deliberately to shock. It also looks at the theoretical frameworks around the abject as set out by Julia Kristeva in Powers of Horror from 1982. Her work was the basis of my analysis, and I have recontextualized into the fashion theoretical context. This process of conjoining provocative content with ensuing public outcry results in a predictable, dramatically heightened visibility. And this is now arguably the basis of some modern online marketing. Within the realm of social media, one of the strongest identifiable manifestations of collective will is the wave of outrage. A hashtag around an event will create a grassroots groundswell and then through viral reiteration, a splash. The ability for cognitive registration of any particular item becomes more and more diffused as the volume of information increases exponentially. The ensuing fight that marketers must participate in to connect and engage with consumers becomes ever more competitive, and the marketing strategies of producers go to ever greater lengths to engage the commodity purchasing public. One need look no further than a recent window display in the windows of a Prada boutique in Soho, New York City. A diorama populated with racist caricatures that seemed designed solely to elicit a reaction. Fashion critic for the Washington Post, Robin Given in Seriously Prada, What Were You Thinking? Why the Fashion Industry Keeps Bumbling into Racist Imagery, described the scene. A display of expensive tchotchkes in the windows of Prada's Soho boutique in New York included one style that recalled a gollywog, the 19th century blackface character with big round eyes and large red lips. The thing also resembled the title character from Little Black Sambo, a children's book of the same era. Either way, the connotations were unequivocally racist. There was also the odious blackface Gucci turtleneck from the Fall-Winter 2018 collection. This was on their website. Gucci has since called upon the expertise of Ryerson University fashion scholar Kimberly Jenkins, whose research focuses on the implications of race in fashion history, business, and image making, to provide diversity training and educate their staff on responsible design practices that do not invoke racial stereotypes and iconography. Jenkins commented in the media on the Gucci incident. I'd like to think it's ignorance. It's a lot of ignorance and people not growing up in a space where there's a whole lot of diversity. The people at Gucci don't understand the meaning behind these images and how damaging they are, end quote. She also noted that although Italy is a country with a diverse immigrant population, this diversity is not reflected in the employees of the prominent fashion houses. I applaud the work of Dr. Jenkins. Education is essential and the best way to bridge cultural gaps and heighten understanding, and thus foster tolerance. In the case of the Italian fashion brands, though, I question if it really is a lack of fundamental knowledge. Cultural myopia can only go so far as an explanation, as both Prada and Gucci are huge international brands with transcontinental offices connected to regional marketing companies and ad agencies in their many trans-global markets. Yet in spite of this, what ended up in the Prada Soho New York City window and on the shelves of Gucci boutiques internationally are what seem like racist visual tropes, dog whistle bait, perfect for outraged social media exposure and outrage, which indeed promptly exploded around the brands and had everybody talking, tweeting, and amplifying. More of Dr. Jenkins' important work can be found here. The brands inevitably try to explain these incidents away as an ignorance of other cultures. This could be easily rectified by a greater diversity in hiring practices, but it also makes the tenuous assumption that none of this was actually intentional, which is very arguable. I used to work as a designer for MAC Cosmetics in the 90s, when it was still based in Toronto. And at that time, we were in every major global market, and we always consulted the local experts before rolling out anything. There also have been far too numerous instances of outrageous fashion offerings that seem blatantly offensive ever to be chalked up to an error or a gap in cultural knowledge. For example, the Urban Outfitters tapestry blanket. A crypto-homophobic misappropriation of our iconic pink triangle, the demarcation used to identify queer concentration camp prisoners during the Holocaust. On the ground of alternating gray stripes, it closely resembled the concentration camp uniform worn by homosexual prisoners in World War II concentration camps. For those not familiar with the significance of the pink triangle, it was the badge that differentiated the homosexual prisoners from others imprisoned in the camps. In the chapter, Pink Triangle Prisoners at Buchenwald concentration camp from 2013, Günter Grau describes the criminalization of homosexual activity and identifies that homosexuals were a targeted group from the beginning of the war and were later rounded up and sent to concentration camps. Within the camps, all prisoners were separated into categories. These were political adversaries, members of inferior races, and inferiors from the standpoint of race biology, and criminals and asocials. The markings to delineate these groups were later formalized to fit within an organized hierarchy of visuals. The markings were sewn onto the clothes of prisoners, left side of the chest and right trouser, along with a unique prisoner number. The signifiers allowed for various groups to be easily identified and segregated with horrifying consequences. For homosexuals, the segregation left them vulnerable to extra abuse from the guards, as well as other prisoners. The experience of these men, once they were imprisoned within the camps, was brutal and resulted in rapid mortality. Unlike the other groups held in the camps, however, the conclusion of the war was not an end to the torturous existence of the homosexual prisoners. For those that were fortunate enough to have survived the ordeal, the end of the war did not bring any relief, as their treatment upon their subsequent liberation at the end of World War II only consisted of further indignities. And many of those who were liberated from the camps were rearrested after the war to serve out their terms of imprisonment. After the war, the West German government began paying reparations to those who had spent time in the camps. But in 1956, the government declared that those imprisoned for homosexuality did not qualify for compensation. In light of the punitive, criminalized climate regarding homosexuality, the agency for recording memory was severely inhibited. As Eric Jensen in The Pink Triangle and Political Consciousness, Gays, Lesbians, and the Memory of Nazi Persecution from 2002 explains, The absence of testimony, of personal memories from the victims themselves, almost all of the survivors lived in either East or West Germany. And in all three countries, East, West Germany, or in Austria, and all three countries, the penal codes continued to criminalize homosexual acts after the war, and police regularly harassed gay men throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Because the legal and social stigma attached to homosexuality remained, homosexual prisoners were understandably wary of telling their stories of persecution, let alone demanding public acknowledgement. The mayor of the village of Dachau, Hans Zauner, typified the hostile climate that these survivors faced when he, with apparent disgust, told an interview in 1960, "You must remember that many criminals and homosexuals were in Dachau. Do you want a memorial for such people?" I personally do. Eventually, the decriminalization of homosexuality allowed for the stories finally to be told. The pink triangle became the symbol of those terrible times, but it also came to denote queer resilience. Thus, using a symbol with this depth of painful association for decorative purposes and solely for the potential cheap publicity that this can elicit is frankly disgusting. Explained away as an innocent mistake, the brand's feeble non-apology rings entirely hollow after an examination of other recent abject marketing offerings from them. There was, of course, the Kent State sweatshirt that appeared to have bloodstains and bullet holes in it. For those unfamiliar with what happened at Kent State University in Ohio, on May 4th, 1970, 4 Kent State University students were killed and 9 injured when members of the Ohio National Guard opened fire during a demonstration protesting the Vietnam War. This is considered to be suitable inspiration for a fashion product? Macabre mirth at a sick joke, perhaps? Well, I, for one, am not laughing. There was also the infamous Eat Less t-shirt, also the Depression Chic tee, the Star of David t-shirts. There were different adult and children's versions offered for that one, as well as various other reductive racist stereotypes. These are described in How Urban Outfitters Trades on Moral Outrage from 2014 by Tim Herrera as, I quote, "Irish people are drunks, trademark Native American symbols look great on flasks, Obama is black, Jewish people are rich," end quote. The alarming regularity of these offensive offerings speaks to the likelihood of their deployment as deliberate marketing strategies by Urban Outfitters to grab media attention. If this is in fact true, it needs to be challenged because in the case of the pink triangle tapestry, it trivializes the Holocaust and cheapens the memory and experience of everyone victimized during those terrible times during the Second World War. However, it is the grande dame of British fashion, Vivienne Westwood herself, who can be credited with bringing Nazi iconography into vogue in the late 1970s, as she incorporated Holocaust chic Nazi iconography into her early fashion designs and the wardrobing for the Sex Pistols punk band, who were managed by her then boyfriend, Malcolm McLaren. There are numerous photos of Westwood and her retinue adorned in swastikas, iron crosses, and Nazi paraphernalia. In fact, her brand was built on this foundation. Truly abject. The choice of the descriptor abject for this particular research was not happenstance. The way that it is applied in this essay derives from the work of theorist and psychoanalyst Julia Kristeva, who in her monograph, Powers of Horror, an essay on abjection from 1982, identified and outlined the terms as a theoretical framework for analysis. For Kristeva, the abject is an expression of, and I quote, "what disturbs identity, system order, what does not respect borders, positions, and rules," end quote. And it does this through upsetting the viewer. The upset is not the all-in gross out found in adolescent movies or the punishing lowbrow shock daredeviling of Jackass. However, that would be the spectacle of the awful. Conversely, the Kristavan definition is particularly efficacious for the analysis of abject marketing of fashion, as it resides within the subtler imbrications of the pain-pleasure dyad. It is the unwanted intrusion of the real. As Kristeva states, the abject is a, and I quote, wound with blood and pus, or the sickly acrid smell of sweat, of decay, end quote. These remove signifiers and instead cause the forced realization of the crushing materiality of human experience. She elaborates on this. Body fluids, this defilement, this shit are what life withstands, hardly and with difficulty on the part of death. There I am at the border of my condition as a living being, end quote. The morbid, the excretory, the pathological, all cause for unwelcome intrusions into a comprehension of a lived reality that consciously and subconsciously seeks to negate these unpalatable truths. Yet, this raw, insolent thing is also identified with some twisted form of pleasure for Kristeva. Tricky. She conflates our enjoyment with the abject with a form of jouissance, which is the French word for enjoyment. As she states, one does not know it, one does not desire it, one joys in it. On jouit, violently and painfully, a passion, end quote. Evoking a visceral reaction that arises as a result of inner conflicts and that manifests in the, quote, in between, the ambiguous, the composite, end quote. This jouissance, she describes, is derived from Jacques Lacan, who used the term to explore the dynamics between pleasure, displeasure, and basic human instinctual drives. And of particular relevance to fashion research, it is used at times to connote the anxiety produced by the separation between physical materiality and the construction of social structures. The joyful and pleasurable in the Kristevan matrix, however, is one that encompasses, and I quote, the immoral, sinister, scheming, and shady, resulting in a terror that dissembles, end quote. A sick form of masochism, perhaps, one that conflates repulsion with pleasure. As she states, one thus understands why so many victims of the abject are its fascinated victims, if not its submissive and willing ones, end quote. Pleasurable perhaps, but not necessarily desirable for its fascinated victims. At first glance, displays of content intended to provoke and offend is an annoyance, yet another blip of poor taste in the ever-marching fashion parade. But when you explore possible connections to the horrific hate crimes that can be observed in society today, it becomes alarming, fundamentally disturbing, actually. Arguably, the acceptance of casual racism and misuse of Holocaust iconography can add tacit support to the far more serious rhetoric of hardcore hate mongering. I'm no fan of censorship. I also believe freedom of expression always needs to be safeguarded. That doesn't mean, however, that I'm going to welcome becoming a punchy bag for some homophobe making hateful humor at my expense, or worse, my body ending up in a body bag. And as a means of selling some random fashion product? No. As someone who has been on the receiving end of some arbitrary, ugly homophobia at times, let me reassure you, it is really not that funny. We live in very troubling times. We live in dangerous times for queer people. The Pulse nightclub massacre was just one awful example of the real threats and violence queer people live with every day. Unscrupulous, abject marketers amplifying toxic messages to heighten brand awareness are willfully playing with fire, and it is time to douse it out with a bucket of cold water. Some things need to be canceled in our culture. Racism and homophobia to start. The bottom line is, who is mocking and attacking in the first place? Who has the motivation, the vested interest in the subjugation of those who actively disrupt rigid gender constructs, or those who wish to eradicate racial hierarchies? Those are the ones who benefit most from these forms of abject marketing, as it resonates and amplifies other messages of both covert and overt racist and homophobic hate mongering, simultaneously undermining the progress of those who are fighting against oppression. They become one more action that further desensitizes people to the profoundly destructive societal forces of racism, the normalization of anti-Semitism, and the nurturance of homophobia. And there are dire consequences to such normalizations. Thank you.